Greetings, dear listeners. From where do you join us this evening? Let us travel far across the centuries, past the tumult of bustling highways and bright electric lights, to a time governed by the quiet discipline of the sword and the profound silence of raked stone. We stand now at the threshold of the Yuan estate, the ancient dwelling of the retired warrior, Lord Tadamasa, where the truest battles were not fought with steel, but against the impatient stirrings of the human heart, and where the garden served as both spiritual fortress and silent master. The sun had barely kissed the high peaks of the surrounding hills when Master Kenzo, the elderly gardener whose hands knew every pebble and every root, knelt at the edge of the vast dry landscape garden, the space known as the Karesansui. His simple wooden rake, a tool used more for profound contemplation than mere physical labor, began its slow, deliberate journey across the pale gravel, pulling the stones into perfect, flowing spirals that mirrored the currents of an eternal, invisible sea. Each meticulously created furrow was a commitment to the present moment, a presence that purged the mind of distractions, leaving the surface flawless and preparing the ground for the silent contemplation that the new day required of the master of the house. This careful effort was not merely about maintaining neatness for human eyes, but about manifesting the inherent structure and harmony of the universe upon the Earth's surface, a spiritual map laid out in miniature. Near the sheltered tea house, built low and purposefully rustic, a hollow bamboo spout tipped rhythmically, filling with spring water drawn patiently from the distant, shadowed mountainside until, heavy with its cool liquid burden, it swung down dramatically to strike a mossy foundation stone with a deep, startling thwack. This sudden, sharp report, known for its ability to startle and discourage foraging deer, held a deeper function within the tranquility of the samurai's estate, serving to shatter the slow, creeping silence and act as a stark reminder of the irrevocable passage of fixed time, interrupting the flow of endless, self-centered thought. Then, after the brief, sharp echo faded entirely into the silence of the moss, the bamboo slowly righted itself, beginning the measured, patient filling process once more, thus teaching the virtue of cyclical patience and the absolute necessity of measured release. Lord Tadamasa had always held that the greatest virtue was the ability to wait. Lord Tadamasa himself, cloaked in his simple robes of dark, understated gray, sat perfectly still upon the veranda overlooking the low, rolling moss mounds, his posture unwavering and perfectly centered like a spear planted in the earth, silently observing the flawless, abstract artistry of Kenzo's daily work. Though his decades of fighting were now long past, the intense discipline required on the cold, brutal battlefield now translated seamlessly into the profound stillness of his spiritual practice, drawing an enduring strength from the garden's ancient permanence and quietude. He watched the ancient cedar trees, gnarled and twisted by centuries of persistent wind and heavy snow, recognizing in their resilient, bent forms the very essence of the warrior code, bending profoundly without ever truly breaking, surviving through quiet endurance and deep rooting. The garden was now his primary teacher, revealing deeper truths about the fleeting nature of life and the value of impermanence that the harsh, demanding edge of a polished sword could never truly impart to the soul. One particular black pine, deliberately trained over many generations to grow in a dramatically horizontal fashion, served as the visual focal point of the southern view, its tough, bundled needles remaining a vibrant, defiant dark green even when layered with winter snows. Kenzo remembered the teachings handed down to him by his own grandfather. The pine does not shed its needles in the winter of hardship, thereby symbolizing the essential samurai qualities of faithfulness, enduring strength, and loyalty in profound adversity, qualities required of any dedicated retainer. Trimming the branches of this revered tree required an almost surgical precision, demanding that the gardener remove only those parts which hindered the overall generations-old vision, a deliberate action that paralleled the careful excision of excess ego, selfish desire, and ambition required for the warrior's true spiritual enlightenment. The robust health of the tree was considered synonymous with the spiritual health of the household, thriving robustly only when pruned ruthlessly of all unnecessary and distracting excess. This was the quiet, profound violence of maintaining beauty, a lesson in necessary reduction and purity. Later, beneath the dappled, flickering shade of the mature maple trees, Kenzo prepared the small, purposefully humble hut for the morning's tea ritual, a rite known throughout the land for its profound, severe simplicity and its intense attention to the finest detail. Every single gesture required, the heating of the heavy iron water kettle, the precise placement of the rough, dark bowl, the delicate whisking of the powdered green tea, was executed with mindful reverence, treating this momentary, ephemeral meeting as if it were the single most important event of an entire lifetime. The aesthetic ideal here was one of deep appreciation for wabi-sabi, which sought beauty specifically in the imperfect, the asymmetrical, and the transitory, accepting the rough texture of the hand-thrown bowl and the quiet, inevitable decay of the thatched roof as perfect reflections of life's own inevitable, natural course. In that small, shared bowl of warmth and bitterness, the usual stringent distinctions of social rank and title momentarily dissolved, leaving only two human souls sharing quiet heat, deep respect, and profound silence beneath the rustling leaves. The stone lanterns, scattered judiciously throughout the mossy landscape, were never lit during the day, but stood as silent sentinels, carved with traditional symbols of protection and longevity, their surfaces worn smooth by centuries of rain and wind. They reminded the observer that wisdom, like the smooth contours of the granite, is achieved only through the abrasive action of time and long, patient exposure to the elements. The paths within the garden were not wide or paved, but consisted of stepping stones, placed deliberately unevenly and far enough apart to compel the walker to focus entirely on where they placed their next step, an exercise in forced mindfulness. To rush through the garden was to risk a fall. Therefore, the only acceptable pace was a measured, slow, and respectful one, transforming the simple act of transit into another form of quiet, moving meditation. This thoughtful design reinforced the samurai's constant need for immediate awareness, reminding the lord that vigilance must accompany every action, however small or insignificant it may seem. As the afternoon deepened, Kenzo turned his attention to the tiny, hidden waterfalls that fed the single pond, their sound a constant, gentle whisper, muffled by the surrounding damp ferns and shade-loving shrubs. These falls symbolized the persistent, unstoppable flow of life force, or ki, and the steady accumulation of water in the pond represented the accumulation of wisdom over a lifetime of diligent practice and observation. The water itself was kept scrupulously clean, symbolizing the pure, untainted nature of the awakened mind, requiring constant tending lest the stillness turn stagnant or murky with the debris of the outside world. The planting of the garden was meticulously planned to ensure that every season offered a different lesson, never allowing for complacency or boredom. In the spring, the delicate, fleeting blossoms of the cherry trees appeared in a sudden, brilliant flash of white and pink, a powerful, beautiful reminder of the glorious brevity of existence, teaching the warrior to live his life fully and without regret, for all things of beauty pass quickly. The summer brought the rich, heavy green of abundance, demanding the constant, patient work of maintenance and trimming to prevent wildness from overtaking the careful design, a reflection of the constant battle against distraction and sloth. Then, in the autumn, The maple leaves turned to spectacular shades of burning crimson and rich gold before finally surrendering their grip and falling to the earth, illustrating the necessary beauty of surrender and the great dignity in letting go of what can no longer be held. This cycle of flourishing, aging, and release provided Tadamasa with an annual, visible syllabus of life's most profound spiritual lessons, written not in ink but in the changing colors of the natural world. Kenzo, observing this transformation daily, felt a deep sense of connection, seeing himself merely as the caretaker of a much larger, eternal truth. As the sun began its final descent toward the distant western horizon, casting long, peaceful shadows across the meticulously raked sand, the entire atmosphere of the garden deepened, becoming cooler, profoundly quiet, and highly introspective. Kenzo began the gentle task of watering the mosses, those deep emerald carpets that clung tenaciously to the ancient, weathered rocks and the rough bases of the stone lanterns. Moss, he knew from long experience, required enormous patience and specific humidity. It did not spring forth overnight in a dramatic flourish, but demanded centuries of deep shade and persistent, dedicated care, symbolizing the slow, cumulative effort required to cultivate a quiet, disciplined mind. It was a profound reminder that true, enduring beauty often resided not in the grand, dramatic, or immediate gesture, but in the small, damp, enduring silence that persevered beneath the deep canopy. Lord Tadamasa finally rose from his long meditation, stretching slowly, bowing deeply toward the entire landscape, acknowledging its silent, profound instruction before retreating into the deepening, shadowy depths of his dwelling. The garden, having fulfilled its quiet duty as a mirror to the soul and a classroom for resilience, settled finally into the absolute tranquility of the night, holding its breath until the dawn. Only the soft, rhythmic chirping of the crickets and the occasional soft, measured thwack of the bamboo waterspout disturbed the deep repose of the estate, a sound that promised renewal and persistence when the first pale rays of dawn touched the meticulously raked sand once more. The discipline imposed upon the placement of the stone and the training of the trees was the very peace that settled into the dones of the man who gazed upon them, a stillness that had been earned through centuries of intentional design and humble stewardship. Greetings, dear listeners. From where do you join us this evening? Lord Tadamasa moved through the corridors, his steps almost entirely silent upon the polished cypress wood, the scent of ancient paper and rich pine resin accompanying him toward his small study tucked away in the eastern wing of the main house. He lit a single oil lamp, its faint, warm glow illuminating the alcove where his writing tools rested, the heavy inkstone, the slender brushes made of badger hair, and a stack of delicate rice paper awaiting the weight of his wisdom. The inner world of the samurai lord was governed by rules as strict as those of the external garden, demanding unwavering focus and the complete eradication of stray thought before the brush was ever permitted to touch the paper. He did not intend to write tonight, but instead unrolled a weighty silk scroll containing the compiled wisdom of his ancestors, a record of border skirmishes, treaties upheld, and lessons learned from costly errors centuries past. Running a careful hand over the fine calligraphy, Tadamasa felt the tremendous, invisible chain linking him to those who had walked these grounds before him, recognizing that the peace he currently enjoyed was not a gift, but an inheritance purchased by unrelenting vigilance and difficult, often brutal, ethical choices made long ago. The cool air of the room seemed to carry the faint echoes of counsel, urging him always toward prudence, reminding him that the greatest failure was the failure of preparation, whether for war or for the quiet administration of justice in his domain. Outside, the world lay hushed beneath a clear, star-dusted sky, the darkness acting as a vast shroud that made the meticulous order of the estate feel both isolated and protected, Yet Tadamasa knew such peace was illusory and ephemeral, dependent entirely upon the strength of his own will and the loyalty of his retainers. He allowed his mind to drift, examining the recent reports from the neighboring province, a subtle shift in allegiance, a rumored gathering of wandering swordsmen, a harvest that promised scarcity rather than abundance, all tiny ripples that could swell into a destructive tidal wave if ignored in their infancy. He had trained his mind, like the roots of the ancient pines in his garden, to seek sustenance even in hard stone, to find strength in resistance, and to anticipate danger long before it revealed its sharp edge in the light of day. He had trained his mind, like the roots of the ancient pines in his garden, to seek sustenance even in hard stone, to find strength in resistance, and to anticipate danger long before it revealed its sharp edge in the light of day. The discipline required to maintain this fragile balance was not abstract, but practical, extending into every physical corner of the domain, resting heavily upon the shoulders of men like Kenji, who served as a lone watchman along the highest reaches of the fortified perimeter wall. Kenji paced his steady circuit, his straw sandals rustling softly against the gravel path, his alertness sharpened by the profound solitude of the hour, understanding that his duty was to be a living extension of the Lord's unwavering will. His existence embodied the concept that security was built upon a ceaseless, monotonous repetition of vigilance, ensuring that the serenity enjoyed by the inhabitants of the inner house was never broken by threats from the outside world. He listened intently to the subtle variations in the night sounds, the rustle of the dense bamboo grove beyond the wall, the distant, mournful howl of a fox in the foothills, the soft, low murmur of the nearby river, analyzing each acoustic detail with trained precision. The difference between a harmless shift of wind and the deliberate footfall of an intruder was infinitesimal, requiring a level of sustained, meditative concentration that mirrored the Lord's own focus during his hours spent gazing upon the static patterns of the rock garden. Kenji filtered out the common noises, reserving his full attention for anything that might signify a deliberate intrusion or ill intent aimed at disturbing the sanctioned peace of the estate. The sound that anchored the watchman's patrol, giving temporal structure to the endless dark, was the regular, resonant thwack of the hollowed bamboo waterspout, drawing water from the high spring and emptying its contents with measured weight against the smooth stone basin below. This gentle percussion, the deer-scarer's quiet alarm, served as a constant sonic measurement of time and flow for Kenji. It was a rhythmic promise that resources were flowing, that balance was maintained, and that the quiet cycle of the day was proceeding as intended. The sound demanded patience until the first bell of the temple signaled the end of his long watch and the moment when the world would return to motion. The bamboo spout itself, though seemingly brittle and light, spoke volumes of flexibility and resilience, bowing slightly with the water's accumulating weight before snapping back with purposeful, necessary energy. A perfect, quiet lesson in enduring adversity without suffering permanent fracture. It demonstrated that true strength lay not in rigid refusal to yield, but in the capacity to absorb pressure and immediately return to one's intended form, releasing the burden completely before the next cycle began. Lord Tadamasa cherished this sound, knowing it represented the unwavering spirit required to lead and to persevere through the lean times that inevitably follow times of plenty. Lord Tadamasa cherished this sound, knowing it represented the unwavering spirit required to lead and to persevere through the lean times that inevitably follow times of plenty. Back in his study, Lord Tadamasa finally extinguished the lamp, allowing the soft, ambient starlight filtering through the oiled paper screens to fill the chamber with a pearlescent, restful gloom. He understood that the night was not merely an absence of light, but a positive, active force, a time for consolidation, for the deep processing of the day's encounters, and for the necessary restoration of the spirit that rigorous discipline demanded. In this perfect, unmarred darkness, the polished wooden surfaces reflected nothing at all, embodying the profound Zen concept of emptiness, which paradoxically held the potential for everything, awaiting the clean slate of the morning upon which new actions would be written. He rose silently, moving toward the screened window that looked out upon the formal part of the garden, where the meticulously raked sand rested, hidden now from sight by the pervasive darkness, yet its order remained absolutely intact. The knowledge that those perfect patterns existed, undisturbed beneath the veil of the night, offered a deep assurance of human effort persisting even when unseen, reinforcing the principle that virtue did not require an audience to hold its truth. The Lord's heart settled into the same deep, cold calm that permeated the ground where the moss patiently clung to the stones. Though the hour was still deep, Tadamasa knew the first bell would ring soon after the moon began its final descent toward the western hills, signaling the strict commencement of the daily rituals which had governed his life since childhood. This included the cold cleansing bath, the precise arrangement of his garments, the silent, measured consumption of his morning meal, and the formal greeting of his chief advisors, all conducted with unhurried precision. Every single action was a small ceremony, a continuation of the discipline observed in the training yard and reflected in the unwavering posture of the ancient cedar that guarded the garden gate. This structured existence was not perceived as a cage or a burdensome restriction, but rather as a reliable framework designed specifically to conserve mental energy and eliminate wasteful triviality, ensuring that when true crisis inevitably arrived, his decisions would be swift, clear, and unclouded. He preferred the predictability of ritual to the chaos of spontaneous reaction, understanding that a peaceful life was simply a well-executed series of planned movements, much like a complex, deadly sword form practiced until it became involuntary muscle memory. The ancient, gnarled pine, which had taken its current majestic shape only through hundreds of years of careful training and restrictive pruning known as niwaki, stood like a silent sentinel, its silhouette dark against the pale, receding sky, symbolizing the enduring power that comes from knowing one's necessary limitations. The tree proved that only by accepting the shaping hand of time and the knife of discipline could one achieve such deep, quiet, enduring longevity. Beneath its branches, the cold dew continued to form, collecting silently upon the broad, thick leaves of the hardy camellias, preparing the world for the cool, damp, rejuvenating shock of the approaching sunrise. A thin, pale wash of faint gray began to bleed into the horizon far to the east, chasing away the deepest blue of the night and hinting at the imminence of the new day, though the air remained bitingly cold and entirely still. Soon, the first official light would touch the meticulously raked garden, illuminating the perfect waves of sand that symbolized the endless ocean of existence and effort, and Lord Tadamasa would return to the external classroom to begin his disciplined study of the world once more. The sound of the crickets, which had dominated the darkness, now began subtly to recede, yielding their rhythmic presence to the first tentative chirps of the waking sparrows hidden deep within the eaves of the roof. The estate was stirring now, not with activity, but with anticipation. The silence was thinning, replaced by the profound quiet of readiness, the sound of servants beginning their duties far below, polishing the bronze fittings and sweeping the entrance stones in preparation for the Lord's formal emergence. Every member of the household understood that the order of their day hinged upon the quiet, disciplined actions of the man who still rested briefly in the shadows of his study, absorbing the final lessons of the receding night before taking up the heavy mantle of daylight responsibility. The garden waited patiently, a mirror ready to reflect the disciplined light of the new morning. Greetings, dear listeners. From where do you join us this evening? A sudden, brilliant sliver of gold appeared on the eastern rim of the world, severing the bond between the deep night and the immediate morning, casting long, sharp shadows across the moss and stones of the meticulously planned landscape. This first, pure light rushed silently across the compound, finding its anchor point in the white gravel of the dry garden, instantly transforming the muted gray waves of raked sand into stark, sculpted mountains and valleys of blinding white effort and spiritual dedication. The sight was brief but profound, signaling the moment of truth when all the previous night's disciplined quiet must translate into the active virtue required of a feudal lord, holding the garden up as a mirror to the state of his soul and demanding perfect readiness for the coming day. Within the silent depth of the study, Lord Tadamasa stirred, not with haste, but with the measured inevitability of a slowly turning millstone, his breath already regulated to the rhythm of the day he was about to command, and the heavy responsibilities waiting just beyond the cedar walls. He did not rush toward the newly arrived light, but rather prepared himself internally, performing the subtle, ancient movements that loosened the stiffness of the spirit and reminded the body of its duty as a disciplined vessel for honor and necessary precision. His hands moved over the rough-spun silk of his sleeping kimono, smoothing the wrinkles as if ironing away any trace of indecision or lingering dream from the fabric of his commitment, preparing to dress for the rigors of governance and warcraft that defined his existence. A near inaudible shift in weight, perhaps the softest shuffle of sandals upon the polished wood threshold just outside the chamber, was the only signal Tadamasa ever gave to announce his readiness. Yet it was instantly understood by Kenji, the personal attendant who waited outside, listening with the trained intensity of a hawk for the smallest sign of his master's movement. Kenji slid the heavy paper shoji door open just enough to allow him to kneel gracefully without disrupting the internal calm of the room, his eyes cast down upon the woven mats, awaiting the silent directive to proceed with the morning ablutions and the careful preparation of the Lord's ceremonial garments. The quiet exchange between them was thick with unstated understanding, a relationship built upon years of shared silence and anticipating needs before they were voiced, honoring the necessity of absolute quietude in the samurai's critical daily transition. The layered dressing was a meditative act itself, each fold and knot securing not merely pieces of fabric, but allegiance to the code of Bushido, transforming the man of quiet contemplation into the figure of authority and decisive action required by his station. The crisp linen undergarments followed the heavy, dark silk of the formal kimono, lending immediate weight and structured formality to his posture, forcing the spine into the perfect verticality demanded by tradition and battle readiness alike. Finally, the long, curved sheath of the katana was secured through the sash, a comforting, familiar weight that rested against his left hip, serving as the constant, cold reminder that peace was only ever maintained by the readiness to destroy it if justice, duty, or the survival of his clan demanded the ultimate sacrifice of the self. Before the potential noise of the day could truly begin to swell around the compound, Tadamasa required 1 cup of thick, bitter green tea, prepared with studied imperfection in a simple, dark brown bowl crafted purposefully to exhibit the beauty of its own rough clay and slight asymmetrical flaw. He lifted the hot vessel to his lips, inhaling the earthy steam that carried the scent of deep forests and wet stone, pausing the world for the brief duration of the sip, drawing discipline from the warmth and finding profound solace in the vessel's honest, unvarnished simplicity, known to the wise as wabi-sabi. This small, silent ritual was his final, firm anchor against the inevitable chaos of external affairs, cementing his intention to face the world with clarity and sober intention, ensuring that the self was truly ready before facing the demanding faces of his retainers and the judging spirits of his ancestors. With the gentle, rhythmic scraping of the shoji doors sliding shut behind him, Lord Tadamasa left the deeply personal realm of his study, transitioning physically and spiritually into the brighter, more actively charged world of the estate's main corridors, where the polished wood floors reflected the rising sun in shimmering, elongated strips. The air here was no longer simply cold and still, but subtly alive with the distant, hushed murmurs of the servants, the slight smell of cooking rice wafting from the kitchens, and the muted sounds of efficient preparation that acknowledged the Lord's presence without daring to intrude upon his privacy. He walked slowly, his measured steps setting the deliberate pace for the entire establishment, a slow, authoritative drumbeat moving inexorably toward the external world where decisions, burdens, and expectations awaited his steady, practiced hand. Waiting patiently at the intersection of the long hallway and the administrative wing, kneeling perfectly upright beside a low, carved table holding meticulously tied scrolls of official documents, was old Sato, Tadamasa's most trusted administrator and oldest retainer, his face a complex roadmap of loyal duty and unwavering diligence. Sato bowed deeply, touching his forehead to the tatami matting in the ritualistic sign of absolute respect, waiting for the Lord to stop and grant permission for speech before daring to raise his voice above a respectful whisper regarding the day's immediate and most pressing administrative necessities. The first formal communication of the day was always the most weighty, setting the serious tone that determined the success or failure of the next 12 hours. Usually concerning vital matters of revenue collection, complex peasant disputes, or the necessary, rigid logistics of the Lord's official traveling schedule for the approaching month. The first formal communication of the day was always the most weighty, setting the serious tone that determined the success or failure of the next 12 hours, usually concerning vital matters of revenue collection, complex peasant disputes, or the necessary, rigid logistics of the Lord's official traveling schedule for the approaching month. Tadamasa paused precisely before Sato, allowing his penetrating gaze to fall upon the elegant, tightly rolled scroll presented to him, sealed with the official chop of the district magistrate and detailing a complex, highly sensitive dispute concerning crucial water rights between two remote villages near the western border of his domain. He did not need to unroll the document fully. A quick, practiced glance at the opening characters and the precise arrangement of the accompanying numerical figures allowed him to grasp the core of the conflict instantly, confirming that the welfare of hundreds of his subjects, dependent wholly upon the fertile rice paddies, rested ultimately upon his immediate, impartial decision and swift resolution. He nodded slowly, authorizing Sato to dispatch a trusted envoy immediately, emphasizing the necessity of listening with a balanced heart to both sides before passing judgment. For true strength and lasting governance lay not merely in swiftness, but always in judicious, unbiased fairness that upheld the law. Leaving the detailed concerns of the internal household and the immediate administration behind, Lord Tadamasa proceeded along the outer veranda toward the great hall of audience, the central nexus of his temporal power, where dozens of lesser officials, guards, and junior retainers would already be assembled, waiting in tense, absolute silence for his formal entrance. The large doors ahead were currently closed, massive panels of dark, oiled wood inlaid with intricate geometric patterns that served as a visual and psychological boundary between the private man and the public ruler. The final mental preparation before assuming the full, heavy mantle of his title. He adjusted the posture of his shoulders beneath the structured silk, felt the solid pressure of his sword hilt resting firmly against his side, and prepared his highly disciplined mind to receive the requests, complaints, and solemn oaths of allegiance that were due to begin the moment those heavy, silent doors were drawn open and the daylight flooded the formal space. Just before the threshold of the great hall, a wide, sun-drenched veranda offered a final, unobstructed view of the dry garden, now fully bathed and illuminated in the cool, piercing light of morning. Its profound stillness offering a moment of unexpected, final counsel before the inevitable clamor of human politics. The perfect, sweeping curves of the white gravel remained utterly undisturbed by foot or wind, a frozen ocean representing eternal calm amidst the temporal storms of political maneuvering and daily administration, quietly reminding the Lord that even in the midst of the most chaotic human affairs, there existed a core of unchanging, ordered, and silent truth. Tadamasa took this silent, visual counsel deeply, drawing one final, long breath of the crisp, cold morning air before signaling with the slightest inclination of his head to the two massive guards flanking the doors, fully accepting the demanding mantle of governance that awaited him beyond the polished wood and the heavy scent of incense. The guards moved instantly, their movements practiced and perfectly synchronized, drawing the colossal doors open with a smooth, echoing rumble that resonated through the entire structure, signaling the official commencement of the Lord's Day and instantly focusing every eye in the great hall upon the sole, powerful figure now framed by the light. The hall itself was vast and dimly lit, filled with the formal kneeling ranks of samurai retainers and administrators, all clad in their dark, severe robes, waiting in a profound, deep silence that demanded a presence of unwavering stability from the man who stood before them. Lord Tadamasa stepped across the threshold, and the silent assembly inhaled, as if the entire weight of the estate and the welfare of the domain had just shifted onto the single point where his polished sandals now rested upon the floor. He did not speak immediately, preferring to move with deliberate, unhurried steps toward his raised platform at the far end of the hall, allowing the absolute quiet to magnify his authority and emphasizing the importance of measured thought over hasty reaction. Every head remained bowed, every movement suppressed, the atmosphere electric with focused anticipation, a physical manifestation of the rigid hierarchy that ensured the stable hierarchy of the feudal lands, from the highest general to the lowest clerk kneeling upon the furthest mats. Only when he reached the platform, turning slowly to face the waiting ranks and seating himself formally upon the silk cushions, did the tension in the room subtly ease, allowing the first whisper of sound, the rustle of silk as the men subtly adjusted their posture, to break the intense silence. The first order of business, signaled by the rising of the chief military advisor, a scarred man named Iwao, whose loyalty was measured by decades of shared battlefields, was the report on the distant northern patrols and the persistent low-level banditry that plagued the high mountain passes. Iwao spoke in a gravelly, concise voice, detailing the movements of the scouts and the necessary reinforcement of the border fortifications, laying out the difficult choices between diverting agricultural labor for military tasks and ensuring the fields were fully sown for the coming harvest. Tadamasa listened with closed eyes for a long moment, visualizing the icy terrain and the logistics of moving men and supplies across the treacherous stone paths, calculating the economic cost against the necessary security of his subjects. He opened his eyes, directing his gaze specifically toward the young quartermaster, whose face immediately flushed under the direct scrutiny of the Lord, asking him a precise, probing question about the inventory of winter stores and the expected depletion rate if the patrols remained active for another 2 weeks past the estimated date. The young man stammered a truthful, accurate reply, confirming Tadamasa's own instantaneous mental calculation, a small, subtle demonstration that the Lord knew every necessary detail of his domain and that no corner of his administration could hide inefficiency or dishonesty. This quiet moment reaffirmed that his rule was founded not just on might, but on meticulous, unforgiving knowledge of the practical workings of his territory and the true cost of every decision made. The morning then devolved into a complex series of administrative and legal reviews, moving quickly from the request of a temple abbot for new lands to the petition of a powerful merchant seeking exclusive trading rights for imported salt, each matter requiring Tadamasa's sharp, decisive judgment and his careful balancing of competing interests. He navigated the treacherous waters of feudal politics with the same calm precision that he had applied to his tea ceremony moments before, always looking past the immediate request to the long-term impact on the cohesion and prosperity of his entire domain. The hours moved swiftly, marked only by the shifting light streaming through the large windows and the occasional, formalized exchange of bowing and rising retainers presenting their reports. As the sun climbed higher, casting the shadows directly beneath the eaves of the roof, the demands upon the Lord's attention grew more focused and potentially more dangerous, culminating in the arrival of an unexpected messenger carrying a sealed diplomatic pouch from a neighboring, potentially hostile province. The messenger, clad in the dusty travel clothes of a long journey, was brought forward immediately, his presence casting a sudden, chilling ripple of focused tension across the ordered ranks of the assembly, suggesting that the day's work might suddenly pivot from administration to conflict. Tadamasa watched the man approach with steady, expressionless patience, already preparing his mind for the possibility of broken alliances or the heavy necessity of swift strategic military planning that such a message might demand. The messenger knelt before the dais, presenting the sealed scroll with trembling hands, a sign of the immense pressure inherent in delivering such an important, potentially war-provoking document directly into the hands of the ruling lord. Tadamasa's own trusted secretary received the scroll, careful not to break the wax seal with the insignia of the rival clan, and presented it to his master on a small, dark wooden tray, maintaining the rigorous formality even in the face of sudden diplomatic emergency. The room fell into an immediate, heavy silence, the previous murmurs of daily affairs instantly extinguished, as every retainer waited to gauge the expression on Lord Tadamasa's face, knowing that the slightest tightening of his jaw or the faintest change in his steady breathing would be the only initial indicator of the imminent danger contained within the document. The room fell into an immediate, heavy silence, the previous murmurs of daily affairs instantly extinguished, as every retainer waited to gauge the expression on Lord Tadamasa's face, knowing that the slightest tightening of his jaw or the faintest change in his steady breathing would be the only initial indicator of the imminent danger contained within the document. Tadamasa took the scroll, the weight of the parchment suddenly feeling heavy and significant, the fate of thousands potentially bound within its tightly rolled form and the carefully brushed characters it contained, reminding him once again of the profound gravity of his inherited responsibility. He broke the seal slowly, deliberately, savoring the moment of absolute quiet before the words written upon the paper could demand action, and began to read the document's contents, allowing his eyes to move with measured speed across the formal script that outlined the demands, threats, or perhaps the unexpected proposals of his powerful and notoriously aggressive neighbor. The sun outside beat down fiercely, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, yet within the hall the temperature felt suddenly colder, awaiting the true meaning of the message that had traveled so far. The silence stretched on, a heavy cord pulled taut between the Lord and his assembly, broken only by the sound of the wind sighing gently through the corridors outside and the distant splash of water from a small courtyard fountain. Lord Tadamasa finished reading the entire message, a lengthy pronouncement detailing a dispute over the demarcation of a boundary river, a classic pretext for military escalation, yet he showed no visible reaction, allowing the weight of the words to settle fully within his disciplined mind before offering the slightest hint of his intended response. He slowly re-rolled the parchment, placing it carefully back upon the wooden tray, signaling that the message, though serious, did not warrant an immediate emotional outpouring of anger or hasty decision, but rather demanded cold, intellectual calculation and strategic patience. He finally looked up, his gaze sweeping slowly across the assembled officials, noting the anxious tension in the shoulders of his chief strategist, and the readiness of his generals to draw upon their maps and tactical notes, acknowledging their fear while silently projecting his own unwavering calm. Tadamasa spoke then, his voice cutting through the prolonged quiet, not with fury, but with the cool, hard clarity of mountain water running over granite, issuing a series of specific, immediate orders regarding reconnaissance and the mobilization of reserve units far to the south, signaling that he understood the true underlying intentions of his neighbor. The immediate pivot from administrative governance to military preparation was seamless, a testament to the samurai's perpetual readiness to defend the ordered existence they labored so hard to maintain. The generals bowed deeply, their faces now alive with focused purpose, relief mingling with the immediate stress of active deployment, and they began to move swiftly but quietly, leaving the hall to initiate the highly complex logistical maneuvers required to ready a professional fighting force. The atmosphere remained charged, but the anxiety was replaced by the determined energy of execution, Tadamasa having successfully steered the assembly away from panic and toward disciplined, immediate response, demonstrating the essential quality of a true leader, absorbing the shock of the unexpected so that those below him could act with focused clarity. The administrative work of the day, however, was far from complete, and another official immediately stepped forward, holding aloft a tax ledger, ready to anchor the Lord once more in the mundane necessities of the domain's financial survival. Greetings, dear listeners. From where do you join us this evening? The official, a man named Kenji, who served as the domain's chief accountant, presented the heavy bamboo-bound ledger, its pages smelling faintly of dried ink and aging paper, a physical symbol of the complex economic web that supported Tadamasa's governance and his armies. Lord Tadamasa accepted the weight of the book, feeling the texture of the rough paper beneath his fingertips, recognizing that the defense of the realm depended not merely on the sharpness of the sword, but upon the successful cultivation of the rice fields and the careful rationing of resources. He understood that the greatest failure was not a lost battle, but the collapse of the structure that fed the people, and he meticulously began to review the columns detailing the spring harvest yields and projected winter stores. This immediate return to the details of taxation and resource management served as a necessary grounding force, preventing his mind from being entirely consumed by the volatile uncertainty of the approaching conflict. Kenji cleared his throat softly, mentioning that the yield from the eastern provinces, though adequate, had suffered a slight reduction due to late spring flooding, a circumstance that would require careful adjustments to the reserves allocated for the coming winter months. Tadamasa listened patiently, his gaze sweeping over the written characters that quantified human labor and natural circumstance, seeing not just numbers, but the faces of the farmers toiling in the mud, whose very lives were tied to these ledgers. He directed Kenji to immediately commission the repair of the affected drainage systems, insisting that foresight was the strongest currency and that immediate infrastructural investment would safeguard future harvests far more effectively than merely hoarding the existing grain. The Lord possessed the profound wisdom that true wealth resided in the continuous, orderly flow of life and resources, not in a stagnant stockpile awaiting inevitable depletion. The remainder of the administrative meeting was dispatched with equal efficiency, addressing matters of local justice, the distribution of iron ore for weapon forging, and the maintenance schedule for the castle's outer wall defenses. As the sun began its descent, casting long, deep shadows across the polished wooden floor of the assembly hall, Tadamasa finally dismissed his remaining staff, instructing them to maintain absolute silence regarding the military mobilization until he issued the formal decree, thereby controlling the narrative of the threat. He rose then, the heavy silken robes of office rustling softly, and moved toward the private wing, seeking the deliberate and quiet contemplation afforded by his inner garden, a necessary pilgrimage to restore the balance fractured by the day's sharp anxieties. The garden, known as the Garden of the Sleepless Carp, was a masterpiece of careful arrangement, designed not for show, but for the cultivation of internal quietude. Its pathways made of smooth river stones leading toward a central pond covered in dark, reflective water. As he stepped onto the veranda overlooking the scene, a feeling of deep, ancient peace began to settle upon his shoulders, lifting the burden of command that had pressed upon him throughout the day's deliberations. His eyes settled on a massive, moss-covered stone lantern situated near the water's edge, a timeless sentinel guarding the stillness which had stood there for perhaps 300 years, witnessing the rise and fall of countless storms and minor wars. He paused, inhaling the cool, moist air scented with pine and wet earth, grounding himself in the unyielding reality of stone and water, which endured long after the transient clamor of human fear had faded into silence. A gentle rustling sounded nearby, and Tadamasa perceived the hunched silhouette of the master gardener, an old man named Hiko, whose hands were gnarled and stained dark by a lifetime spent working the soil, yet whose movements possessed the precise grace of a practiced dancer. Hiko was tending to a low-growing cushion of emerald moss, meticulously plucking out a single errant weed with thin bamboo tweezers, treating the smallest intrusion upon the order of the garden with the same gravity Tadamasa applied to a threat against his domain. The Lord watched the gardener work for a long moment, recognizing in Hiko's disciplined dedication a reflection of the samurai ideal, perfection sought through tireless, patient application, achieving a state of profound and simple beauty through focused effort. Tadamasa understood that true mastery was not loud or dramatic, but quiet and unending, sustaining the world one careful detail at a time. "Hiko," Tadamasa addressed him softly, ensuring his voice carried no trace of the day's political tension. "The garden remains unmoved, indifferent to the shifting tides outside the castle walls." Hiko did not rise fully, but bowed low from his knees, continuing his task as he replied, his voice a dry whisper like wind moving through reeds. "My lord, the stones do not fear the storm, but they are patiently prepared for its arrival, resting low against the earth until the wind has passed entirely." Tadamasa nodded slowly, absorbing the metaphor inherent in the old man's simple words, realizing that the resilience required of a leader was akin to the strength of the deeply rooted pine, bending but never breaking entirely beneath the weight of necessity. The garden was a tangible instruction manual for command, teaching that stability was achieved by accepting and accommodating the forces of chaos, rather than vainly attempting to crush them outright. Leaving Hiko to his essential work, Tadamasa moved toward the central pond where the water, undisturbed by any ripple, acted as a flawless mirror to the rapidly darkening sky, capturing the faint silver hue of the rising half-moon. The water held the image of the moon and the surrounding maples with such still perfection that it was momentarily difficult to discern where the physical world ended and the reflected world began, offering a moment of pure, unadulterated clarity. He gazed into the dark surface, searching for any sign of uncertainty in his own reflection, reviewing the rapid decisions made earlier that day regarding the mobilization, judging them against the cold, impartial standard of the silent, ancient landscape. There, reflected in the dark water, beneath the enduring light of the moon, he found not pride, but a quiet conviction that duty had been fulfilled with the necessary ruthlessness and speed, leaving no room for regret. Even in the deep quiet of the inner sanctuary, a faint, metallic rhythm began to drift from the distant castle yard. The measured clanging of hammers against anvils, as the armorers worked through the night to reinforce weakened joints and sharpen dull blades. This distant sound was a sharp, constant reminder that the peace he sought was a carefully constructed and constantly defended illusion, maintained only through the tireless efforts of every soul within the domain, from the lowliest armorer to the chief accountant. The contrast between the deep, restorative stillness of the garden and the demanding, practical clamor of military preparation highlighted the precarious balance of his existence, forcing Tadamasa to acknowledge that true rest was a temporary luxury that must always yield to the immediate demands of stewardship. He allowed the sound to wash over him, accepting it as part of the night's symphony, knowing that order required both the quiet hands of the gardener and the heavy hands of the blacksmith. He moved away from the water's edge then, rounding a large standing rock placed specifically for contemplation, noting the delicate placement of tiny stones that represented distant islands within the sea of raked white sand, a miniature world of strategic isolation. Though he desired sleep, he knew that a commander's vigil was often required in the hours before a great decision, when the stillness of the night could either breed clarity or fester with doubt. Tadamasa decided to walk the perimeter of the inner ward, assuring himself that the immediate defenses were sound, seeking the practical reassurance of heavy wood and cold stone beneath his touch before allowing himself to surrender to rest. His footsteps were silent on the wooden floor, a shadow moving between the sleeping chambers and the high windows overlooking the main courtyard where the first preparations were already underway, hidden by the mantle of darkness. A single oil lamp burned low in the main watchtower above the massive gates, casting a weak, flickering light that suggested watchfulness rather than comfort, and he saw the silhouettes of the guards changing their shift, moving with hushed military efficiency. This unseen activity below him was the reassuring pulse of the fortress, confirming that the initial shock of the potential conflict had transformed into the methodical movement of disciplined troops. He stood there for a long time, the cool night air refreshing his face, focusing his awareness on the distant perimeter, listening not for the sounds of an immediate threat, but for the absence of chaos, confirming that his authority still held the entire structure firm against the rising tide of uncertainty. The silent, heavy commitment of the fortress to its duty mirrored his own, drawing strength from the knowledge that they were all intertwined, the leader and the led, bound by the fragile promise of continued existence. Greetings, dear listeners. From where do you join us this evening? Tadamasa finally turned from the high window, the necessity of rest superseded by the necessity of preparation, and began his silent descent from the outer walls back toward the inner chambers where his scrolls and ink awaited. He moved through the narrow, unlit corridors, passing the dark shapes of sleeping soldiers who trusted his vigilance implicitly, knowing that their lord was the last shield between them and disaster. The air grew slightly warmer as he approached the central keep, leaving behind the chilling awareness of the vast, silent world outside the fortress walls and re-entering the small circle of human endeavor. He carried the solitude of his vigil with him, a necessary weight that separated the commander from the common man, demanding a constant internal reckoning of courage and consequence. He entered his small, private study, a room deliberately stripped of luxury, containing only a low writing desk, a few essential scrolls stacked neatly, and a single, sturdy cushion resting upon the tatami mat. The stillness here was absolute, an insulating quiet that allowed thoughts to move without the interference of noise, much like clear water allowing stones at the bottom to be clearly seen. He did not immediately sit, but instead opened the external shutter slightly, letting the clean, cold scent of the pre-dawn air sweep through the room, cleansing the space of the lingering atmosphere of the previous night's worry. This ritual of preparation was as vital as any tactical maneuver, ensuring that the mind was as sharp and clean as a newly whetted blade before the serious labor began. This ritual of preparation was as vital as any tactical maneuver, ensuring that the mind was as sharp and clean as a newly whetted blade before the serious labor began. Moving to the desk, he took up the polished inkstick and the shallow, smooth Suzuri stone, beginning the slow, deliberate task of grinding the solid carbon against the water to release the deep, luminous black liquid. The rhythmic shh, shh, shh of the stone was the first sound of his day, a meditative cadence that forced his attention entirely into the present moment, dissolving the fears of tomorrow into the simple focus of the hand and the material. The richness of the ink became a reflection of his own readiness. If the ink was thin and pale, so too was the resolve. If it was dark and substantial, then clarity was assured for the decisions that lay ahead. He watched the black liquid pool, sensing the strengthening of his own core resolve, readying himself to draw the lines that would determine the fate of his domain. As the grinding ceased, the faintest hint of pale gray began to stain the eastern sky, announcing the arrival of dawn not with glorious color, but with the subtle, unavoidable increase of light, the color of practical necessity. The sounds of the fortress began to shift from the hushed breathing of night watch to the deliberate industry of morning. The soft clatter of wooden buckets in the kitchens, the distant, clear signal of a bamboo flute announcing the muster of the first troop rotation, and the heavy creak of the well pulley being worked. The world outside his study was now undeniably awake, demanding immediate engagement and the transition from philosophical reflection to concrete command. He glanced towards the small, central courtyard visible through the open shutters, where his personal gardener, a man named Hiroshi, who had served the family for 40 years, was already at work, despite the impending crisis. Hiroshi was carefully raking the white gravel of the small kare-sansui, dry landscape garden, meticulously smoothing away the lines left by the wind and shadow, restoring the geometric perfection of the wave patterns. Tadamasa marveled at this persistent dedication to beauty and order, observing that even when war stood at the gates, the necessity of maintaining the delicate balance of the inner spirit remained paramount. The sight of the endless, patient sweep of the wooden rake across the shifting stones offered a silent, profound instruction in perseverance, reminding the daimyo that true stability lay not in avoiding change, but in constantly correcting and restoring order after chaos has passed. The act of maintenance, Tadamasa mused, was the ultimate act of defiance against entropy, proving that the human will could impose pattern upon the universe, even if only for a few moments until the wind or shadow shifted the stones once more. He understood then that the duty of the warrior was fundamentally similar to the duty of the rake, to sweep clean the field of ambiguity, to define the lines of conflict with clarity, and to ensure that the ground upon which they stood was firm and prepared. This momentary communion with the silent dedication of the gardener fully settled his spirit, anchoring him completely to the present moment, just as he heard the soft shuffle of feet outside his door signaling the arrival of his chief vassals. The heavy paper screens slid open with minimal sound, revealing the kneeling forms of his most trusted advisors. Lord Shigemori, the elderly steward whose counsel was rooted in deep historical precedent and caution, and Captain Kenji, the young, fiercely ambitious strategist whose eyes burned with the zeal of untested capability. They entered and bowed low, their collective silence acknowledging the immense gravity of the morning. All three men aware that the decision made within the next hour would seal the destiny of the entire domain for the coming season. The small, Spartan room became instantly charged with the weight of hundreds of lives, compressed by the unspoken knowledge of the advancing enemy forces. Tadamasa raised a hand, bidding them to remain seated, and he spoke first, his voice low but penetrating, bypassing the immediate tactical concerns to address the root of their commitment. He reminded them that their defense was not merely about preserving the walls or the stored wealth, but about honoring the generational duty to their ancestors, and ensuring that the rice fields and the simple lives of the farmers remained undisturbed by the brutality of invasion. He spoke not as a general hungry for victory, but as a guardian of order, grounding their immediate crisis in the deep, unchanging purpose of the ruling class to provide stability and protection. Lord Shigemori, his face a roadmap of hard-won wisdom, spoke first, his voice a dry, measured rasp, advising absolute caution and emphasizing the immense advantage of their fortress's natural defenses and formidable siege engineering. He stressed that their primary strength lay in patience, suggesting that they should allow the rival army to exhaust its initial momentum and deplete its forward supplies against the unyielding stone of the outer wall, making time itself their most reliable and insidious weapon. He urged Tadamasa to think of the weeks, not the days, asserting that to venture forth now would be to trade a nearly guaranteed defense for a highly speculative, bloody confrontation in the open field. He urged Tadamasa to think of the weeks, not the days. Captain Kenji, whose energy seemed barely contained by the formal kneeling posture, countered with restrained passion, arguing that passive defense invited demoralization and risked conceding the surrounding territory unnecessarily, which would cripple the autumn harvest. He advocated for a swift, overwhelming preemptive sally by the light cavalry, aimed at disrupting the enemy's main supply train before their full siege complement could be brought into position. Kenji spoke eloquently of the psychological edge of initiative, claiming that a sudden, sharp blow would introduce confusion into the enemy ranks and affirm the defenders' willingness to fight, shifting the balance of morale in their favor. Kenji spoke eloquently of the psychological edge of initiative, claiming that a sudden, sharp blow would introduce confusion into the enemy ranks and affirm the defenders' willingness to fight, shifting the balance of morale in their favor. Tadamasa listened to both sides with detached attention, his gaze drifting past them toward the scroll hanging on the far wall, a piece of calligraphy depicting the character for Ichi, one, symbolizing unity and singularity of purpose. He understood that both caution and aggression held necessary truths, but that the true mastery of war lay in recognizing the single, decisive point where those two opposing forces must merge into a single, unwavering action. The philosophical moment of reflection now dissolved entirely into the pressing need for concrete logistical security, forcing him to set aside the debate of engagement versus siege and focus on the immediate structural realities. "We shall prioritize the ground beneath our feet," Tadamasa stated, his decision final and unwavering, effectively ending the strategic debate for the moment. He issued his first specific directive: to immediately reinforce the vulnerable northern gate structure, where the weakest wood had begun to show its age, with salvaged iron plating drawn from the old, unused smithy storehouse beneath the inner ward. Furthermore, he commanded that every last measure of grain and dried provisions be sealed, inventoried, and secured against any potential fire or penetration, grounding the fortress's collective fear in the heavy labor of survival. This pragmatic demand for immediate physical work redirected the nervous energy of his vassals and troops alike, channeling their anxiety away from abstract fear and into the tangible reality of preparing their ancient, unyielding structure for the coming storm. Greetings, dear listeners. From where do you join us this evening? The heavy silence of internal debate was swiftly replaced by the grinding clamor of immediate industry, a necessary sound that echoed determination throughout the high walls of the compound. The rhythmic clang of hammers striking cold iron plates resonated from the northern approach, where the weary wooden frame of the old gate was being buttressed and transformed into a formidable barrier capable of enduring sustained assault. Dust motes danced furiously in the shafts of fading afternoon light that pierced the fortress courtyard, Stirred up by the hurried footsteps of countless troops dragging sacks of rice, casks of pickled vegetables, and heavy coils of rope toward the deepest, safest storehouses built into the bedrock. This unified, grueling effort served as a powerful collective meditation, anchoring the hearts of the warriors to the present moment and stealing their attention away from the spectral fear of the unknown invaders waiting beyond the horizon. Once the initial flurry of fortification had subsided somewhat, leaving sweat and purpose where nervous chatter had been, Tadamasa retreated not to his personal quarters but to the highest watchtower, demanding a clear vantage point across the surrounding rice paddies. He instructed his most trusted scout, a wiry man known only as Kaze, Wind, to slip out under the veil of twilight, seeking definitive intelligence on the enemy's disposition, their numbers, and, crucially, their intended line of advance. The weight of inaction was now greater than the burden of labor, forcing the commander to stand motionless for what felt like hours, his gaze sweeping the undulating green landscape for any telltale sign of movement or the rising smoke of unauthorized fires that might betray the encroaching host. It was a terrible patience, this art of waiting, a form of combat waged entirely within the confines of the mind, testing the absolute limits of composure while the world outside shifted toward darkness and potential chaos. The door to the war room slid open, admitting his cousin and second-in-command, Kenji, whose face bore the heavy exhaustion of organizing the supply chains and the deployment of the few Ashigaru levies available. Kenji did not speak of the gates or the stores, but rather of Tadamasa's young son, Taro, who was currently practicing his calligraphy under the stern but loving eye of the estate's elderly scholar. Tadamasa nodded slowly, acknowledging the unspoken fear that shadowed all commanders in such moments, the fear that their duty might end the lineage they were fighting to preserve, and spoke softly of the necessity of the warrior's path, not merely as a code of death, but as a blueprint for continuation and generational honor. He affirmed that the preservation of the clan's name and purpose, represented by the innocent hand holding the brush downstairs, was the highest victory, a truth far surpassing any tactical success or failure achieved upon the ramparts. This conversation, focusing on the future generation rather than the impending clash, solidified their shared resolve, transforming their defensive strategy from a mere fight for survival into a solemn act of ancestral responsibility. As the last vestiges of daylight bled from the western sky, painting the high clouds in shades of somber violet and bruised orange, the pace of work slowed, replaced by the hushed movements of men settling into their watch positions. Torches were lit around the perimeter, casting long, dancing shadows that played tricks upon the eye and magnified the silent tension that now saturated the air. Yet these flames were kept intentionally low and sparse, lest they offer the enemy a clear target or illumination for their advance. Tadamasa moved quietly among the sentries, his voice low and comforting, offering short, precise instructions regarding patrol routes and signaling methods, ensuring every soldier understood the grave importance of absolute vigilance during the long, vulnerable hours of the deep night. A chill wind, carrying the undeniable scent of rain and distant, freshly trampled earth, curled over the fortified walls, hinting strongly at the thousands of approaching footsteps that now inexorably marched closer to their quiet sanctuary. Every small, natural sound became an object of intense scrutiny. The rustling of leaves in the thick bamboo grove, the abrupt cry of a night heron taking flight from the riverbank, and the distant, muffled thud that might signify the movement of heavy siege apparatus or merely the fall of an aged log. Tadamasa stationed himself upon the main keep's roof, where the wind was coldest and the view clearest, choosing this exposed vantage point to demonstrate both his confidence and his commitment to enduring the same discomfort as his men, setting a silent standard of unwavering fortitude. He allowed himself only the meager comfort of a thin, padded vest beneath his armor, knowing that any softening of his own resolve, any luxury taken in this moment of crisis, would instantly ripple downward and weaken the entire structure of the fortress's morale. Thus, the night settled around the fortress like a cloak woven of profound silence and acute expectation, waiting for the first discordant note that would shatter the fragile peace and initiate the long, brutal song of battle. The hours passed with excruciating slowness, marked only by the shifting phases of the moon and the occasional, necessary whispers of the changing watch. Tadamasa watched the distant horizon, realizing that the greatest tool the enemy possessed was not their superior numbers, but the corrosive weight of fear that they projected simply by existing outside the walls, unseen and unknowable. He felt the cold seep into his bones, recognizing this discomfort as a necessary penance, a physical cost paid for the immense responsibility of every life currently sheltered beneath the roof of his ancestral home. The air grew thick with the smell of damp pine and cold ash, a smell that spoke of isolation and the profound self-reliance required when a small, determined force prepares to face the overwhelming tide of history. Around the second hour past midnight, a faint, almost imperceptible signal returned from the darkness. 3 precise, high-pitched whistles, the prearranged sign of Kaze the scout returning with critical information. Tadamasa immediately descended from the roof, his boots barely making a sound on the ancient wooden stairs, and met the exhausted scout in the dimly lit inner courtyard, where the only sound was the soft rush of water flowing into the koi pond. Kaze, breathing heavily and covered in the muck of the rice fields, knelt swiftly and delivered his report in a voice thick with exhaustion and urgency. He confirmed that the enemy host was vast, numbering far greater than initially feared, and that they carried substantial engineering equipment, including scaling ladders and several massive battering rams forged specifically for breaching thick gate structures. The scout further reported that the enemy commander had ordered the host to encamp exactly 1 league from the fortress, planning to utilize the remaining darkness to establish their perimeter and launch the main assault precisely at the first light of dawn. The distance of 1 league meant that they possessed barely 3 hours of remaining quiet before the world would erupt into the fury of conflict, a window far smaller than Tadamasa had hoped for. This intelligence galvanized him, replacing the meditative patience of the night with the sharp, cold clarity of immediate action, and he immediately summoned his chief strategists and lieutenants to the war room. He knew that any further preparation must be swift and surgical, designed not to overhaul the defense, but to sharpen the existing structure to a perfect, lethal point, ensuring that every arrow, every stone, and every loyal man was positioned optimally for the terrible dawn that was fast approaching. He glanced one last time toward the inner garden, mentally bowing to the stillness, and then turned fully toward the war, accepting the inescapable fate that lay just beyond the eastern ridge.